Hello everyone, Just Podcast TV is here. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified on new content.
Episode 13. The Poorest Billionaire. You're my little apple. I love you so much. After enjoying the music for about 10 minutes, James's phone rang. It was Scott Parker. Scott Parker was his colleague and also his best friend in the company. Apart from work, they also had a good relationship in private. James did not need to think about the reason for the call. He must have called to ask him why he hadn't come to work yet. "Hey, Parker, what is it?" James answered the phone. "What is it? James, do you want to die? Why haven't you come to work yet? Don't you know you're late? The general manager is about to start the rounds. I also heard that the boss will be coming over soon. If the boss learns that you're late, I'm afraid you won't be able to claim this month's bonus." Scott's words were like a machine gun, firing nonstop at him. It seemed that he was even more anxious than James, the person involved. James could feel his sincerity. The guy remembered him in his time of need. "Scott, All right, cut the crap. I'll tell the general manager that you went to the toilet. I'll cover for you for a while. Hurry up and get a taxi to come over." James wanted to say that he was going to resign, but before he could finish, Scott interrupted him. He said his piece and hung up the phone. Scott's action made James feel warm in his heart. He was touched. He had witnessed the evil in the people's hearts with his own eyes. He was fortunate to have a sincere friend in this concrete forest where people treated each other with indifference. This is good too. You have to stick to it until the end. Anyway, there's nothing urgent for me to do. I can go to the company and hand in my resignation letter. This can be considered a perfect ending for my working identity. James put down the phone and pondered for a moment. In the end, he decided to go to the company to settle the resignation procedures. He would also treat Parker to a meal and thank him personally for being so kind to him. One must show appreciation every once in a while. After that, he would go to the sales department of Lux Villa District to check in and see what kind of reward he could get. He had a car now, so it was convenient for him to go anywhere. James started the car in excitement, his whole body trembling. He hit the accelerator lightly, and the low roaring of the engine shook his eardrums. All men love this sound. It could make people thrilled for no reason. James was already over the moon for starting the first supercar in his life. But when he heard the low hum of the engine, a rush of blood shot to his head. He thought that he was not in a good condition to drive, so he got out of the car to calm himself down for a while. Then he got back in and drove his brand new Ferrari 812 towards his office building. The red Ferrari was indeed too flamboyant. He received the attention of passersby on the way to the entrance of the district. "Hey, isn't that James?" When James passed by the small supermarket, the young shopkeeper saw James in the driver's seat. She could not help frowning and muttering to herself. "Hey!" The shopkeeper quickly ran out of the supermarket and called out his name, but the guilty James did not dare to stop. He drove the car straight to the entrance of the residential area. Looking at the indescribably handsome car, the young shopkeeper laughed and said, "Looks like he's really made a fortune. I have long felt that he's not a simple person, but I did not expect him to be such a huge surprise." As she gazed at the Ferrari driving far away, there was not the slightest bit of jealousy on her face. Her heart only contained blessings for him. "Sir, stop the car." James was stopped by the security guard at the entrance. "What is it?" James stuck his head out. "Hello, sir. You need to pay for parking here." The security guard came over and politely addressed him. "Oh, how much?" James didn't mind or feel offended. $8. The security guard kept his head low. He didn't want to act rude in front of such a rich guy. "What? $8? The car has only been parked for one night. Are you kidding me with such a high fee?" James had already taken out his phone and was about to pay when he heard the fee. His eyes widened as he stared at the security guard. It wasn't that James's reaction was exaggerated, but there were only $3 in his cell phone. It wasn't enough. If he was stopped by a security guard because of the parking fee of $8 while driving a luxury sports car worth $500,000, now that would be a joke. "Sir, This is an old neighborhood. The parking space is very short, so the parking fee is very expensive. $8 per night. I hope you can understand." It was probably because James drove a good car, so the security guard was very respectful and did not dare to offend him at all. Oh, so that's how it is. If it's the resident of your neighborhood, how much does it cost to park the car for one night? James couldn't flare up when he saw the security guard's good attitude. However, he accurately caught a crucial detail. The parking fee for an outsider was very expensive. That was why he quickly asked the question. After he said this, even he felt a little embarrassed. He drove an expensive supercar and now he still had to haggle over such a small amount. He felt really embarrassed. However, he had no other choice since his pocket didn't allow him to throw an attitude. With the amount of money in his account, he wouldn't be able to get out of this neighborhood if he didn't fight for it. Although he wasn't in a hurry, if he kept blocking the entrance, it would only make him lose face. Probably because he did not expect someone driving such an expensive car to ask such a question, the security guard was left stunned. He looked at James with a strange look in his eyes. Then he patiently replied to James. "For a resident, it would only cost $2.50 a night." When James heard that, he did not care about his vanity anymore. He quickly asked again, "What do you mean? Is it the same for a tenant?" When the security guard heard that, the strange look in his eyes intensified. But as the security guard of the neighborhood, it was his responsibility to serve the residents. It could even be said that they were his source of income. Therefore, he patiently explained to James, "The tenants pay the property rent, so naturally they count as the residents of the neighborhood." James let out a sigh of relief. Then he said to the security guard, "I'm a tenant in the AVC apartments. I live on the 5th floor, apartment number 2 of the 15th building. So now I only need to pay $2.50, right?" The security guard was dumbfounded. He could not believe his ears at all. This was the first time he had met such a stingy person who drove a luxury supercar. He now seriously suspected that this guy was a driver hired by some rich man. He secretly drove the sports car home to impress his girlfriend. In addition, James was wearing cheap clothes. This made him more certain of his own judgment. "Yes, of course, but please show me your ID. I need to check your rental information." The security guard forced a smile and remained polite, but his smile was uglier than crying. James cooperated and took out his ID card. The security guard took the card and went into the on-call room. 2 minutes later, he came out. After handing the ID card back to James, the security guard's expression turned cold. It seemed that after James's identity as the tenant had been confirmed, he was even more certain that he was just a driver who secretly drove a rich man's sports car home. Hence, he no longer spoke so politely. After James received the ID card, he coldly said, $2.50. Damn it, this is too practical. He changes color like a chameleon. Seeing the change in the attitude of the security guard, James could not help but curse in his heart, but he was too lazy to argue with him. "Thank you." James didn't hesitate anymore. He picked up his phone and scanned the code to pay. Then he drove the cool Ferrari out of the neighborhood with a loud roar. Seeing James drive away, the security guard smiled at another colleague, shook his head, and said, "If you don't have money, why are you pretending to be a rich guy? This is the most stingy person I've ever seen who pretends to be a rich man." On the roadside, James could not help but laugh when he saw that there were only 50 cents left in his account. Just now, he almost couldn't get himself out of the neighborhood. If he wasn't smart enough, he would have embarrassed himself. James patted the 10 high-priced property certificates on the passenger seat. He suddenly felt that he might be the poorest billionaire in New York. Episode 14. I helped him resign. After the landlord scolded him about the rent last night, the embarrassment of buying mineral water at the supermarket, and the farce about the parking fee, James had realized a serious problem. He had nothing in his pockets. He was short of cash. If he did not have cash in his hands, it would be useless even if he had $100 billion worth of assets. Therefore, he had to make use of the rewards he had on hand to start making profits. After all, the most practical problem he faced now was eating and drinking. If he did not have enough liquid funds, he was no different from James of the past. He was poor. Real estate was real estate. He needed to convert it into cash. Eating, refueling, buying clothes, and watching movies all cost cash. He couldn't possibly bring out a property certificate and give it to the cashier now, could he? He would be regarded as an idiot. Then how could he use the available resources in his hands to turn them into cash? It was obvious that he could only take two paths. One was to sell, while the other was to rent. When he thought up here, the name of Mitchell Haynes flashed in his mind. He was the real estate agent he met last night at the restaurant. That guy had a kind face and looked honest. James felt that he should be a reliable candidate. Thinking of this, James had already formed a rough plan in his mind. However, he was not in a hurry to call Mitchell Haynes. He decided to go to his company first and settle the matter of his resignation.
Scott, didn't you say that James went to the toilet? Where is he now? Is he taking a shit or what?
In front of Dalton Pharmaceutical Limited, James had just walked to the door of the company when he heard the roar of the general manager, Mr. Jeffrey, coming from the direction of the meeting room. Scott almost buried his head in his pants. He didn't even dare to breathe loudly. The other colleagues around him also lowered their heads. They didn't dare to look up at the two people in front of them. Their boss, Mr. Evans, was standing there with the general manager. In addition, their company's performance this month was especially bad. Hence, Mr. Evans was in a bad mood, getting irritated at the slightest of things. Under such circumstances, no one dared to speak. Otherwise, they might really get fired.
James, it's already been half an hour. Why haven't you arrived yet? Don't tell me you're still so stingy as to take the subway. I told you to take a taxi.
Scott clenched his fist tightly, sweat dripping down his forehead. He was concerned about James while scolding the guy in his heart. Seeing Scott remain silent, Mr. Jeffrey pointed at him and scolded.
How dare you lie in front of President Evans? I think you're just looking to be fired. I'll give you 3 more minutes. If James does not come out of the toilet, you will lose your job. Get lost with him.
Mr. Jeffrey glanced at his watch and gave Scott his last order. Scott frowned, a bad feeling rising in his heart.
What should I do?
Scott was already married. He had parents and children to take care of, so he was now under a lot of pressure. This job was his life. If he lost it, he would not know what to do in the future. It was already difficult for people like them to make a living out of their meager salaries. The atmosphere in the meeting room was so oppressive that it made it difficult for people to breathe. As time passed, Scott's back was drenched in a cold sweat. His clenched fist was burning hot, and his heart was in a mess.
Sir, this is not right. It's not a problem for you to fire me when I am late, but you have implicated the innocent Scott. You shouldn't do this, right?
Just as Scott was imagining his bleak future, James walked in from outside the conference room with a calm expression. He threw down the question while staring straight into Mr. Jeffrey's eyes. James was usually friendly and easygoing. He was not a person without a temper. He disliked people bullying his friends the most. Furthermore, Scott was implicated because of him. All eyes instantly turned to James, who was standing at the door of the meeting room. An instant later, all of his colleagues' eyes were filled with shock. Although none of them dared to speak at the moment, the expressions of amazement and confusion couldn't be hidden from their faces.
Is this James? Why is he so calm? Does he want to be fired? How dare he talk to the general manager like that?
He's really domineering, cool, and handsome.
Where did he get his confidence from?
Even Scott stared at him in stunned silence, as if James was a stranger to him. He opened his mouth worriedly. He wanted to ask James what he was doing. However, he didn't dare to say anything in the presence of the two big shots of the company.
You...
James, who was usually subservient to him, actually dared to question Mr. Jeffrey. He didn't give him any face at all. Furthermore, Mr. Evans was watching the whole scene. Mr. Jeffrey was so angry that he couldn't say anything. He took a deep breath and pointed at James with a sneer.
James, you're half an hour late, yet you dare to contradict me in front of everyone. President Evans, what do you think we should do about this?
Mr. Jeffrey turned to seek Mr. Evans' opinion, who had been silent the whole time. It was obvious that he wanted to punish James. Mr. Evans waved his hand and said expressionlessly,
James, you're fired.
Although Mr. Jeffrey was a general manager, his behavior was despicable, seeking revenge for the slightest misgiving. When he saw that his evil plan had succeeded, he looked at James with a proud smile. Mr. Evans, do you think I want this lousy job? To tell you the truth, I came to the company today to resign anyway. I thought we could all get along since I've been an employee here for a long time. Even if I quit, we should maintain a cordial relationship. That's why I came to personally hand in my resignation letter, but I was clearly overthinking this. There's no need for you to fire me. I quit. The smug smile on Mr. Jeffrey's face had just risen when he heard James's biting words. That smile froze on his face. The other colleagues in the meeting room widened their eyes. They didn't believe that this guy really was James. What guts he had. Scott was also anxious. He rushed out and pulled James's arms, whispering in his ears, "Tucker, are you crazy?" However, he patted Scott's shoulder and smiled at him. He reassured him with his eyes. Instead of getting his meaning, Scott was so worried that he was about to cry. How could he relax? How long did they have to strive in this company before they could reach their current level? How much did they have to struggle to accumulate the resources in their hands? Only they knew how challenging and tough it was for them to get to where they were today. How could he let James give up this job that helped them survive in New York so easily? Facing James, who spoke so firmly, Mr. Evans was also thoroughly enraged. He could discern that James didn't care about the job anymore. Expelling him would no longer have an impact on him. In fact, he couldn't care less. However, even if he wasn't worried about himself, what about his friend Scott? He would fire him as well. He would like to see how calm he would be then. After thinking for a while, Mr. Evans looked at James and snorted.
James, you sure have guts. Since you're so capable, take your friend Parker with you and leave together.
Scott felt like his mind was going to explode. He felt as if he had been struck by lightning and his world was crumbling apart. The other staff members in the meeting room all went silent. They all stared at the floor. They didn't even dare to breathe loudly, afraid that they would meet a similar fate as those two. Scott felt as if he fell to the ground and lost his soul. The atmosphere in the meeting room was extremely depressing. Only the boss, Mr. Evans, and the general manager, Mr. Jeffrey, had a cold and mocking smile adorning their faces. Evans stared at James with scorn. However, since he was the boss, he could not directly ridicule James. Otherwise, he would be belittling his esteemed status in front of his employees. But the meaning in his eyes was as clear as day.
You dare to fight me? You don't have the ability.
Mr. Jeffrey also had a similar expression. To curry favor with Mr. Evans, he even gave his boss a thumbs up, showing an expression of ingratiating himself. If only the two of them were here, he might even have licked his boots. In his mind, he even outlined the tragic scene of James kneeling in front of Mr. Evans, crying and begging him not to fire Scott. He was not alone in imagining that scene, though. Even Mr. Evans and all of his colleagues here thought the same thing. But they were destined to be proven wrong. James had changed. No, he had transformed. After Mr. Evans' voice faded, the scene of James begging for Mr. Evans didn't appear. Not only that, he looked at Evans with a contemptuous smile hanging on the corner of his lips. Mr. Evans, I was just about to say the same thing. You stole the words right out of my mouth. I like people who know their own limits. You don't need to fire Scott. He also quits. Episode 15. A sports car worth half the company. James's words were like a clap of thunder, jolting everyone once again. Even Mr. Jeffrey, who was previously pleased with himself, stared at James as if he were a monster. At this moment, a feeling of unfamiliarity suddenly bridled in his heart. He didn't seem to know this guy at all. He suspected whether this was still James who worked under him or some other guy with similar looks.
He actually took the initiative to help Scott resign? Has he gone crazy? Isn't James a little too bold this time? He goes too far. Tucker is acting so arrogant. I wonder where he gets his confidence from. He actually went head-to-head with President Evans. This is the first time someone in our company has ever done this. Tucker is bold.
After recovering from the sudden turn of events, the other staff members in the meeting room couldn't help but start discussing in hushed voices. The current James had grown an extra pair of balls. No, he must have grown a dozen extra balls. Mr. Evans' expression became extremely ugly. In his opinion, he had chosen the best timing and location to fire someone. He could set an example for everyone to not step out of their bounds. But now, he felt that not only did he fail to gain any advantage, but he had also lost to an ordinary employee. This really made him a little embarrassed.
Shut up, all of you. Don't you want to work anymore?
The general manager, Mr. Jeffrey, took note of the situation and immediately shouted. The noisy meeting room turned silent in an instant. It was as if they had been struck with a silencing spell. Mr. Jeffrey then turned to James and mocked.
James, you have to pay the price for acting tough. However, what's the point of putting up a false bravado now? Since the two of you have already been fired, you are no longer employees of my company. Get lost now. Otherwise, I'll have the security guards kick you two out. Do you understand or not?
You don't have to worry about that. I didn't want to stay in this crappy place anymore either. Scott, let's go. James pulled Scott and wanted to leave. However, Scott, who had regained his senses, was not willing to leave. He immediately shook off James' hand and said,
James, what the hell are you doing? Do you plan to live on air in the future?
After rebuking James, he turned to Mr. Evans, whose face was so ugly that it looked like he had eaten a fly, forced a smile, and said,
Sir, don't listen to his nonsense. There's something wrong with his brain, so he was confused for a moment. He's not sensible. Don't lower your esteemed status by arguing with him. Neither of us will resign, and I promise we'll work even harder in the future. We will not let you down as long as you place your trust in us.
However, Mr. Evans gazed at Scott with ridicule. James had disgraced him in front of everyone. How could he take back what he had said? To him, it was not a loss to fire two ordinary staff members, but to Scott, it was a fatal blow. Scott was so anxious that he was about to go crazy. Seeing Mr. Evans ignore him, he really wanted to drop to his knees and beg him.
Sir, please, for the sake of the elderly and the children in my home and James, who has yet to settle down, please give us another chance.
Scott pleaded with Mr. Evans, but what he didn't know was that in Mr. Evans' eyes, his plea was nothing. Mr. Evans had been staring at him coldly all this time. He remained indifferent. However, Scott's actions completely touched James's heart. He was almost reduced to tears. He really did not expect that even at this moment, Scott did not abandon him. He was still helping him keep his job. This was definitely a true brother, a friendship that should be maintained and cherished for a whole life. So how could he let his brother grovel at others' feet? He had discarded his self-respect, yet he was still met with ridicule and scorn. Scott. James held Scott's arm and pulled him. He then whispered something into his ear. The others didn't know what James said to Scott, but to their surprise, after a few moments, Scott gradually quieted down. He stared at James with indescribable amazement in his eyes. There was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and confusion in his gaze. He grabbed James's hand with shaking hands and asked in a trembling voice,
James, was what you said true?
Brother, have I ever lied to you? James met his gaze and reassured him.
That's right. Why are we still working here? Let's go.
Scott's attitude took a U-turn. Without any hesitation, he took off his identity card and threw it away before swaggering out the door. This sudden change dumbfounded everyone. They really couldn't understand it. Even Mr. Evans and Mr. Jeffrey couldn't figure out what was going on today. First it was James, and now Scott. When they reached the door, James turned around and said to everyone in the meeting room, "By the way, guys, I'll treat everyone to dinner at 6 o'clock tonight on the 3rd floor of the Chef's Grill restaurant. I hope everyone will be there and have a good time. Just treat it as a farewell dinner from me." After James finished speaking, he walked out of the meeting room side by side with Scott while chatting and laughing loudly. They left the crowd in a stupor. However, after a few steps, James returned. Standing at the door of the meeting room, he pointed at Mr. Jeffrey and Mr. Evans. "Oh, I forgot to mention just now. Tonight's farewell dinner is for everyone here except for you two." Mr. Evans and Mr. Jeffrey's expressions were contorted. They were in a terrible state. If it wasn't for those two, the meeting room would have become a fish market after James left. After all, the place James invited everyone to dinner was the best Western restaurant in town. It was famous for its extravagant prices. Normally, they wouldn't even dare to think about dining there. Yet James was actually treating all of them. Could it be that this kid had suddenly made a great fortune or won a lottery? Although the hearts of his ex-colleagues were in turmoil, the entire meeting room was still extremely quiet. Mr. Evans' face was extremely gloomy. No one dared to step on his tail. Even the general manager, Mr. Jeffrey, did not dare to open his mouth. He stood there respectfully and held his breath. Mr. Evans was the boss, after all. Although he was furious at the moment, he would not vent his anger on his employees. If he wanted to continue doing business in New York, he still had to rely on these employees.
All right. All of you are dismissed. Get back to work.
After a few minutes, Mr. Evans waved his hand at everyone, indicating for them to leave. Everyone heaved a sigh of relief and quickly left the meeting room. "Wow, look, isn't that James?" A young lady was sitting by the window. She had just returned to her desk and casually glanced outside. Unexpectedly, she saw James opening the car door of a cool red sports car. She couldn't help but exclaim out loud. Everyone rushed over when they heard her shout, "I'll be damned, a Ferrari 812. This is a luxury car worth $500,000. Looks like this kid is really getting rich. No wonder he was so confident just now." The employees all looked at James with envy. They couldn't help but discuss with each other, and the whole company instantly became noisy.
Why are you all gathered here and not working?
Mr. Evans stepped out of the meeting room and saw the commotion. He was already in a bad mood, so he scolded harshly. Everyone immediately dispersed and returned to their seats. Their discussion had aroused curiosity in him. He walked over to the window and saw James sitting in the Ferrari. His pupils contracted, and he whispered in his heart,
"What? James Ferrari 812? He drives this kind of car?"
Mr. Evans finally understood where James' confidence was coming from earlier. His company was not that big, with a total value of about $10 million only. However, James's sports car was worth more than $500,000, equivalent to almost half of his company. No wonder he was so arrogant and full of confidence just now. In today's society, money was everything. However, there was one thing Mr. Evans could not understand. How come this James became so rich all of a sudden? Could it be that he was a successor of some hidden family? Or that he had inherited some inheritance?